On the morning of March 18, 1945, the air over southern Germany trembles with a sound unlike anything most people on the ground have ever heard. Near the airfields around Munich, mechanics step back from a sleek aircraft whose swept wings catch the pale spring sunlight. The familiar growl of piston engines is absent. Instead, a high-pitched roar rises steadily until it becomes a piercing howl, echoing across the concrete dispersal area. Dust and loose gravel scatter behind the aircraft as twin jet engines gather power. The machine accelerates with startling urgency, leaving behind a shimmering trail of hot exhaust that distorts the cold morning air. For those watching, it feels as though they are witnessing the future arriving decades ahead of schedule. The pilot eases the aircraft into the sky. Almost immediately, it climbs beyond the reach of many conventional fighters waiting to intercept it. Allied bomber crews flying towards Germany later report seeing an unfamiliar shape streaking across the heavens at astonishing speed. Some struggle even to identify what has flashed past them before it disappears into the clouds. According to wartime reports, several bomber formations are attacked so quickly that defensive gunners have only seconds to react. The aircraft appears, fires its weapons, and vanishes before escorting fighters can effectively respond. In the closing weeks of the Second World War, it is one of the few machines still capable of surprising the overwhelming Allied air forces. Yet beneath this remarkable display of technology lies a nation on the brink of collapse. Germany's cities burn beneath relentless bombing. Railways lie shattered. Fuel is rationed with increasing desperation. Factories struggle to maintain production despite repeated air raids. Experienced pilots, once the backbone of the Luftwaffe, have been lost in years of exhausting combat, while many replacements possess only a fraction of their predecessors' training. The Third Reich still unveils advanced weapons with dramatic promises, but each new innovation arrives against a strategic reality that grows more hopeless by the day. The aircraft lifting into the Bavarian sky is the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet-powered fighter. To many German leaders, it represents the ultimate Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapon, a technological breakthrough capable of reversing Germany's fortunes. Its appearance inspires both confidence and desperation. Newspapers portray it as proof that German engineering remains unmatched, while military commanders hope it can finally blunt the relentless streams of Allied bombers devastating the Reich's industrial heartland. Those hopes rest upon genuine achievement rather than fantasy. The Me-262 is unlike anything previously deployed in aerial warfare. Powered by two turbojet engines instead of piston-driven propellers, it reaches speeds of around 870 km per hour, making it roughly 150 to 200 km per hour, faster than many of the finest Allied fighters operating at the time. In level flight, few opponents can catch it. To bomber crews accustomed to defending themselves against conventional interceptors, the new aircraft introduces an entirely different kind of threat, one that compresses reaction times from minutes to mere moments. But remarkable technology alone cannot alter the course of history. By early 1945, the strategic balance has shifted decisively. Allied armies advance from the west after crossing the Rhine, while Soviet forces push relentlessly from the east towards Berlin. Germany's industrial centers continue to produce weapons, yet transportation networks are increasingly unable to deliver them efficiently. Aviation fuel has become critically scarce. Even completed aircraft often remain grounded for lack of trained pilots, spare parts, or usable runways. Every successful flight consumes resources the nation can scarcely replace. The Me-262 therefore enters history burdened with an impossible responsibility. It is expected not simply to win battles in the air, but to compensate for years of strategic setbacks, dwindling manpower, collapsing logistics, and overwhelming Allied numerical superiority. Historians continue to debate how much influence it might have exerted had it appeared earlier in greater numbers. What remains beyond dispute is that it represented one of the most significant technological leaps of the entire war. As the silver jet disappears into the morning sky, leaving only the fading echo of its engines across the battered German countryside, few observers can fully appreciate what they have just witnessed. The aircraft embodies extraordinary ingenuity born amid extraordinary destruction. It is both a masterpiece of engineering and a symbol of a regime racing against time. In that fleeting moment above Bavaria, the future of aviation has already arrived, but the future of Germany has almost run out. The story of the Me-262 did not begin in the final desperate months of the war. Its origins stretched back to a period when Germany still believed victory was achievable through technological superiority. In the late 1930s, aviation engineers across the world were exploring a revolutionary idea, replacing the traditional piston engine with a new form of propulsion that could produce far greater speeds. The principle behind the jet engine was deceptively simple. Instead of using rotating propellers to push an aircraft through the air, a jet engine would compress incoming air, mix it with fuel, ignite the mixture, and create a powerful stream of exhaust gases that pushed the aircraft forward. The concept promised speeds beyond the limits of conventional fighters, but turning theory into a reliable battlefield machine proved extraordinarily difficult. In Germany, engineer Hans von Ohain and aircraft designer Willy Messerschmitt became central figures in this technological race. The Messerschmitt Company received a contract from the German Air Ministry in 1938 to develop a jet-powered fighter aircraft. The resulting design was initially known as the Project P.1065. Engineers envisioned an aircraft built around speed, placing the new engines beneath swept wings to reduce aerodynamic resistance and improve performance at high velocities. The design presented enormous challenges. Early jet engines were fragile, inefficient, and extremely difficult to manufacture. Unlike a conventional aircraft engine, which had decades of development behind it, turbojet technology was still in its infancy. Engineers struggled with high operating temperatures, unreliable materials, and limited fuel efficiency. The turbine blades inside the engine had to survive conditions that pushed available metallurgy to its limits. The first prototype, the Me-262V1, flew on April 18, 1941. However, it was not yet powered entirely by jets. Because the new engines were still unreliable, the aircraft initially used a conventional piston engine mounted in the nose. The first true jet-powered flight came later, on July 18, 1942, when a prototype equipped with two Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines took to the air. The achievement was historic. For the first time, a fighter aircraft designed for combat had flown using only jet propulsion. But behind the success was a long list of technical problems. The Jumo 004 engine, although revolutionary, had a short operational life. Early versions could sometimes run for only a few dozen hours before requiring major maintenance. Critical materials such as nickel and chromium, essential for heat-resistant components, were increasingly scarce as Germany's war economy deteriorated. Despite these difficulties, testing revealed the Me-262 possessed extraordinary performance. The aircraft measured approximately 10.6 meters in length, had a wingspan of around 12.5 meters, and weighed more than 6,000 kilograms when loaded for combat. Its two Jumo 004 engines produced enough thrust to propel it far beyond the speed of Allied fighters. It carried four 30mm Mk-108 cannons mounted in the nose, giving it devastating firepower against heavily armed bombers. Each cannon could fire large explosive shells designed to destroy aircraft with only a few hits. The Me-262's greatest advantage was not simply its speed, but the combination of speed and weaponry. A conventional fighter attempting to attack a formation of Allied bombers needed to approach carefully while avoiding defensive fire. The jet fighter could approach at a much higher velocity, strike quickly with heavy cannon fire, and escape before enemy fighters could respond. However, the aircraft's development became trapped in the complicated politics of Nazi Germany's military leadership. By the time prototypes demonstrated their potential, the war situation had changed dramatically. What had once been an ambitious project designed to secure air superiority became viewed as a desperate weapon intended to delay defeat. In 1943 and 1944, debates emerged over how the Me-262 should be used. Many Luftwaffe officials wanted it deployed immediately as a fighter to counter Allied bombers. Others, including Adolf Hitler, became focused on using it as a fast bomber capable of striking Allied forces after the planned invasion of Western Europe. Hitler believed the aircraft's speed made it ideal for a new form of rapid bombing warfare. This decision contributed to delays in its operational introduction. Historians continue to debate the exact impact of Hitler's intervention, because the Me-262 already faced serious obstacles unrelated to political decisions. Engine production was slow, pilot training was limited, and Allied bombing repeatedly damaged factories and supply networks. The aircraft was not a simple solution waiting to be released. It was a complex machine requiring an industrial system that Germany increasingly no longer possessed. By the summer of 1944, the strategic environment had become catastrophic for Germany. Allied forces had landed in Normandy, liberated large parts of France, and were advancing towards the German border. The Luftwaffe was struggling to protect its own territory against thousands of Allied aircraft. The Me-262, which had once represented a vision of future warfare, now entered service in a battle that was already moving towards its final stage. The first operational units began receiving the aircraft in 1944, but transforming an advanced prototype into an effective combat weapon required more than engineering brilliance. Pilots needed training. Mechanics needed experience. Ground crews required specialized equipment. Airfields needed protection. Every part of the system had to function perfectly, and by this stage, Germany was fighting a war where perfection had become almost impossible. The Me-262 was not created because Germany was winning. It was created because Germany was searching for a technological escape from a situation that conventional weapons could no longer solve. It represented an extraordinary achievement of engineering, but it was arriving in a conflict where time, resources, and strategic options were rapidly disappearing. By the beginning of 1945, the Messerschmitt Me-262 had finally reached the battlefield in meaningful numbers, but it entered the war at a moment when Germany's ability to exploit its advantages was already severely damaged. The aircraft that had once promised to transform aerial warfare now faced the reality of a nation fighting on collapsing foundations. The first operational jet fighter units were formed around specialized Luftwaffe groups, most famously Jagdverband 44, commanded by the experienced fighter pilot Adolf Galland, a former general of fighters who had become increasingly critical of Germany's wartime leadership. Galland understood the Me-262's potential. He believed that, used correctly, the aircraft could become a powerful interceptor capable of inflicting serious losses on Allied bomber formations. When the jets entered combat, they proved that this confidence was not misplaced. On July 25, 1944, a Me-262 prototype flown by test pilot Alfred Schreiber reportedly engaged an Allied reconnaissance aircraft, although the details remain debated by historians. The first confirmed operational combat missions came later as small numbers of aircraft became available. By early 1945, Me-262 pilots were conducting attacks against Allied bombers and fighter formations across Germany. The experience of facing the jet was unlike anything Allied pilots had encountered before. The aircraft could climb rapidly, accelerate quickly, and outrun almost every piston-engine fighter in combat conditions. Allied pilots flying aircraft such as the North American P-51 Mustang and Supermarine Spitfire had enormous experience, excellent training, and highly capable machines, but they could not match the Me-262's raw speed. However, Speed alone did not guarantee victory. The Me-262 had weaknesses that became increasingly dangerous during combat operations. Its engines were delicate and required careful handling. Pilots had to avoid sudden throttle changes because the early turbojets could suffer compressor failures, a problem that could cause a sudden loss of power. During takeoff and landing, the aircraft was especially vulnerable because its speed advantage disappeared when it was moving slowly. Allied commanders quickly recognized this weakness. Instead of trying to chase Me-262s in the sky, Allied fighters began attacking them on the ground and during their most vulnerable moments. Airfields used by German jets became important targets. Aircraft that could dominate the skies could still be destroyed while parked on the runway. The aircraft also suffered from a shortage of trained pilots. By 1945, Germany no longer possessed the experienced airmen who had built the Luftwaffe's reputation earlier in the war. Many veteran pilots had been killed, captured, or exhausted by years of fighting. New pilots often received limited training before being sent into combat. Flying the Me-262 required skill and discipline, and mistakes in such a high-performance aircraft could be fatal. Despite these limitations, the jet achieved notable successes. According to wartime claims, Me-262 units destroyed numerous Allied aircraft, particularly heavy bombers. Exact numbers remain uncertain because wartime victory claims from all nations were not always accurate. What is clear is that the aircraft forced Allied planners to confront a new technological reality. Jet-powered combat aircraft were no longer a future possibility. They were already appearing over Europe. The Me-262's influence extended beyond Germany. Allied engineers had been developing their own jet aircraft, but the German aircraft demonstrated the urgency of the new technology. Britain had already flown the Gloucester Meteor, while the United States was developing aircraft such as the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star. These aircraft followed different development paths, but the appearance of the Me-262 confirmed that the age of the jet fighter had begun. When compared directly, the Me-262 was an impressive machine. Its top speed of approximately 870 kilometers per hour exceeded most Allied piston fighters. The Gloucester Meteor could reach similar speeds, but it entered service primarily for defensive operations over Britain and saw limited combat during the war. American jet development was also advancing, but production and deployment came too late to significantly influence the conflict. Yet technology was only one part of warfare. The Allied advantage came from industrial strength, logistics, and numbers. By 1945, Allied air forces could replace losses quickly and maintain thousands of aircraft in operation. Germany could produce advanced machines, but it struggled to manufacture enough of them, maintain them, fuel them, and provide trained personnel to operate them. The Me-262 required strategic conditions that no longer existed. If Germany had fielded large numbers of reliable jet fighters earlier in the war, historians continued to debate how much impact they might have had. Some argue they could have caused serious disruption to Allied bomber operations. Others point out that Germany's deeper problems, fuel shortages, limited resources, and overwhelming Allied production, would still have remained. A weapon can change a battle, but it cannot always change the outcome of a war. If you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribing genuinely helps us continue bringing remarkable true stories like this to the channel. By the time the Second World War ended in Europe in May 1945, only around 1,400 Me-262 aircraft had been produced, although far fewer were actually operational at any one time. Many completed aircraft never reached combat because of shortages, damaged infrastructure, or lack of trained personnel. After Germany's defeat, the Me-262 became one of the most valuable technological prizes of the war. Allied nations captured examples, studied the design, and used the knowledge gained from German research to support their own post-war aviation programs. The aircraft's swept-wing design, jet propulsion system, and operational lessons influenced the rapid development of military aviation during the early Cold War. Today, surviving Me-262 aircraft preserved in museums and collections around the world serve as reminders of both human creativity and the destructive circumstances that produced them. They represent a moment when engineers achieved something extraordinary, while the society around them was collapsing. The story of the Me-262 is therefore not simply the story of a weapon. It is the story of a technological revolution arriving at the worst possible moment for the nation that created it. The same aircraft that demonstrated the possibilities of the future also revealed the limitations of technology without time, resources, and strategic direction. It was faster than its enemies. It was more advanced than many aircraft flying against it. It carried weapons capable of devastating targets in seconds. But it arrived after Germany had already lost control of the skies. The roar heard above the German countryside in 1945 was not the sound of victory approaching. It was the sound of a new era beginning over the ruins of an old one. The Me-262 proved that the future of aviation belonged to jet power. It showed the world that aircraft could move beyond the limits of propellers and piston engines. It changed military thinking and accelerated the transformation of air warfare. Yet behind the brilliance of its design was a powerful historical lesson. Innovation can create extraordinary machines. Engineers can overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Human imagination can push technology beyond previous boundaries. But no invention, no matter how advanced, can escape the realities of history. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was a weapon of tomorrow, built in the final hours of yesterday. Its engines carried it faster than any fighter before it, but they could not carry Germany away from defeat. And as the last jets disappeared into the skies of a shattered Europe, they left behind a legacy that was not defined by the war they failed to change, but by the future of flight they helped create.